Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning and welcome to the Encounter program. I'm Reverend Rachel Helgeson. I'm the pastor at Northminster Presbyterian Church in Endwell, New York. You might know it as being that church across the street from main Endwell High School. I also today, this is a host day, so you get a few of us together to chat about fun things like worship. And I have Reverend Dr. Joe Sellepack and Reverend Jeff Kellam. So welcome to the both of you. And it's not often the three of us get to chat. And miss Mark, but you know, maybe he'll pop in later. We'll see. I'm glad to see both of your faces and be able to talk about worship. I think part of the reason that y'all asked me to be the host for this is that some of you may or may not know is that I am currently working on my Doctor of Worship at IWS, which is the Institute of Worship in Jacksonville, Florida. It's been an interesting time to be a full-time pastor and a doctoral student at the same time during COVID. Yeah. But I would say it has been an amazing time to be thinking about worship. And that may sound interesting to some of y'all, but from my own perspective, it's helped me see what the values of worship are and how it's changing and evolving and yet still remains anchored in tradition. So I'm curious if either one of you have experienced that. What anchors worship for you in tradition, and what do you see is evolving in your traditions?
Go ahead, Joe. Active pastor.
Well, you know, it's interesting from, you know, I grew up firmly ensconced within evangelicalism. And for us, the worship's really centered around the Bible. And so you would have scripture being read, you would have people commenting on scripture, and then you would have singing scripture. So it was like scripture was inundated, you know, in worship, and even in a collective sense, you know, and so as a result of that, you can do that, you know, through COVID. You can do it on an electronic media. And where I find myself really at a loss has to do more as I've grown and I've become deeper in my theology of worship. I have a problem with us experiencing things sacramentally through the internet, and I don't know how to kind of deal with that kind of juxtaposition where you're on the one hand you're wanting to be accessible, you want it to be about scripture, and then sacramentally it requires you know, the breaking of the bread, the drinking of the juice or the wine, and the real physicality of that. And it doesn't translate very well, even if you send it home with people, you know, and they have it at home and they're all doing it at the same time. It doesn't have the same effect on the internet as it does when you're gathered together inside of a room together. So,
I'm going to pause for just
yeah. So I struggle.
A big word called sacrament, and we're assuming that everybody knows that word. I know that word. Welcome, Mark. We're glad you're here. I hope that you know that word. And Joe obviously knows that word. Maybe Jeff knows that word.
I don't know it very well, obviously.
Yeah. So sacraments It depends on what tradition you're coming from, what is considered a sacrament and what is considered sacramental. If you're Roman Catholic, you have 7 sacraments. Do y'all know what those are?
Marriage, last rites,
Confirmation.
Yeah, confirmation, baptism, mass. Those are what, 5 or 6 of them?
Confession.
Confession is the other one, yeah.
So I'm a Presbyterian, and for Presbyterians, after the Reformation, which thanks Luther, and thank you Lutherans, there's 2 sacraments, which are baptism and, depending on the tradition that you come from. You might have heard the word Eucharist or communion. Both, they have their own different reasons. I'm not going to go into all that right now, but just to know, I just wanted to kind of give you a snapshot of what there's different understandings of what sacrament means. And for some of our more Baptist free traditions, evangelical traditions, there is celebration of baptism and communion, but it is not considered a sacrament, which is another part of the history. So when we're using the word sacrament or sacramental, I just wanted to clarify, depending on what tradition you come from, what we're talking about right now is baptism and communion mostly. But for those of you that come from a more Catholic tradition, that's going to be a more expansive word for you. For those of you that come from some nine denominations, it's going to be a little bit more settled into a smaller definition. And for those of you that come from a more free tradition and a Christian tradition, that may feel like a weird word for you. But what we're talking about is baptism and communion. So I know that in all Christianity, we do celebrate that with a different understanding. So I just wanted to pause for just a second just to clarify that word, because it's a big one, but it's all has a lot of history and some internal conversation around it too within our denomination. So sorry, Joe, I just wanted to make sure that that was the point.
It's okay. I mean, it's interesting because I took a class with Robert Weber at one point in time, and he talked about the evangelical tradition and its sacrament. And the sacrament for the evangelicals is the breaking open of the word. So it is a sacrament for us. That would be the sacrament. It's when the word is read, when it is experienced by a community, and when it is enacted upon. So that's it's kind of it's a really good segue into what I was saying. So thanks so much for doing that, Rachel. That was quite good.
The question was, and Mark has joined us since you asked the question, Rachel. You want to go back to that first question?
So my question was about how you have experienced worship grounded in tradition, but also what has evolved for you in the recent last couple of years in the midst of all the things happening in our world with a pandemic and movement towards different ways of worshiping. Joe is just expounding about how he struggles with what it means to have sacrament when we talk about that being in person and embodiment, us being together, and how things have been sort of shifted. And what does that mean when you do that on the internet? Does that now you're not together and it doesn't have the same impetus? And this has been certainly an argument, and not an argument, but I would say a concern and a question that I think every Christian denomination has been struggling with. Each have come up with different answers, but even within their own denominations have had different responses within the leaders of the churches. So that's where Joe was. And so I'm just curious where you are, Mark, on all of this and the bigger question.
Yeah. Well, we certainly have been making it up as we go along. And that's an uncomfortable place to be. I mean, from one moment having a church sanctuary full of people to the next Sunday, there was no one there other than 2 iPhones and 2 tripods. That was it. To where we've kind of morphed into now, where we're streaming on multiple platforms, and maybe half the congregation is back, the other half is not. We kid it takes 3 weeks, 21 days to make a habit. Well, we've been in the habit for a year and a half now of not attending worship. And the dynamics in all of that, which are difficult and difficult to adjust to, because whether we know it or not, everything is different. Everything, even those that are there, can feel it's different. You know, the vibes are different. You know, the comfort level is different. And it is even, I'm sure, that way with those that join us, you know, on the live feed. It's got to be different for them. And it's kind of coming to, how then do you form community?
Right.
That's really, as a matter of fact, this last Sunday, it was probably one of the most recent Sundays where we truly felt the sacredness of worship. Because I paused during my sermon and I walked down and I said, I'd like to take 10 seconds, only 10 seconds. It'd be like pulling off a Band-Aid. You do it real quick, and I promise it won't hurt. Where we had to turn to each other and simply say, I need you. I need you. And it was a moment of sacredness that we haven't been able to create or recreate because of where we are. We tried very hard to do that. We try to do great things with music and, of course, great preaching and all of that kind of stuff. But it just is different. And making it up as we go along has been very uncomfortable, has been extremely laborious in lots of different ways, but also it's been enlightening as to what we can do when we need to do it, right? Especially when it comes to worship.
And it has certainly opened, it's taken us outside the box.
Yes.
Yeah. Opened us beyond the box of our sanctuaries, to be sure. When COVID first struck and our church closed down, Union Presbyterian Church was online only, and all of the worship leaders were in their homes. So the pastor was in her home at her study. The musicians were in their homes. It was all mixed together because we do have a tech guy who's very talented and was able to pull it together at short notice. But it was still from home. All the worship elements were there, the prayers, the sermon, although changed considerably. We're not trying to project to a room full of people. So the pastor of the church, Reverend Pat Robb, was at home speaking to an iPhone. So all the elements were there, except for congregational singing, except for having communion, except for passing the peace to one another, except for being in community. It seemed to me that the worship that I grew up with was based on the Word, and Presbyterians were really, really good at that word that sometimes went 25, 30 minutes, and congregational singing. And gosh, you take those two things away and the fellowship. So you take those three things away, and my goodness, worship, I'm not sure I worshiped. I think I watched worship rather than. And now that we're back in the sanctuary, even with a kind of a much smaller congregation, to be sure, but at the same time, that outside the box thing means that we had some folks who moved away, for example, down south, and they're able to join us each week. We have other folks who have unvaccinated children, and they're still watching us on the tube. So, yeah, we're there, but we're not there. And I think we're going to be in this time of transition for some time to come.
And Jeff, I read an article in the Christian Century this week where a woman whose husband has severe disabilities and they have not been able to worship together until Zoom. Yeah. And it was a pretty significant moment for her and for her family. So while we're talking about not being present with each other, for that person, the presence was there. You know, it was like very different than what I would have thought was important, and it came out in a different kind of way. So I'm with you on that. I think there are unexpected benefits that have come from this.
Yeah.
And that's the delicate dance that we're dancing right now, between pining for the good old days and rejoicing in the things that have been a blessing that have come out of this. Yeah.
Right.
So if you're just joining us, I am Reverend Rachel Helgeson, and we're talking a bit about worship. The sacraments, which I explained a little bit earlier, it's a big, expansive word. We talked a bit about worship and how it's grounded in tradition, but also what that means for us today. And I have with me Reverend Jeff Kellam, Reverend Dr. Joe Sellepack, and Reverend Mark Kimpland. And it's been a really lively conversation, particularly we're talking right now about the struggles and the blessings that have come with the changes in worship. I know while you all are talking, I was thinking about how in my own congregation at Northminster, we've actually seen some of our adults who have not gone to church at all are now plugging back in. They live in different places and they're plugging in and attending worship. And when they come home, are like to visit their families, are actually asking questions of me that I have never heard young adults ask questions. So that's an interesting thing because, and a lot of them said it's just their schedules are really crazy. And so they want to be part of a community of faith, but they feel like their home church is where they're grounded, and things have been all over the place. I've also heard, just like Joe, what you were talking about, some homebound folks who feel like now we understand where they're coming from. Some folks who didn't connect at all on the internet, but they are from our congregation are getting copies of the bulletin and copies of the sermon, have said, thanks for making this a priority again. I go with my little groups of people in our nursing home and we haven't been able to see other people, but it makes me feel like I can connect even though so it's been interesting to rethink like who have we been including and who have we been excluding in worship, and how do we balance all of those pieces together? I guess one of the things that I wonder, each 500 years or so, the church goes through changes, right? And
right.
Yeah, we do in 500 years what it takes the business world 5 months to do. So
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when it happens quick, like so I'm just thinking about, Reformation is a Protestant is part of our history, and also part of the Catholic Church's history. We look at it probably differently, but Luther put some theses on the door and was complaining about all the things, and he thought he was just going to change it from the inside out, and whoops, he's created a whole new church, and then some other churches pop out of that, right? And now we're about a little over 500 years, and we're having this pandemic. Also, if you keep in mind, there was the plague at the time when all this stuff was happening during the Reformation, and they didn't have coffee. So I just want to put those 2 points out to you.
Oh, my Lord.
Coffee. You can't stop the pandemic, but you can provide coffee.
So which one is worse, Rachel?
I don't know. It's a good question. I would say now that it's one thing to read about how these shifts in the church happen with worship. How is it to live it out? Because I'm sure all of you have read some things about these different incremental changes that have happened in your denominations, but also these big changes like the Reformation. And now I feel like from my own perspective, we are now going through another worship change and experience. How are you dealing with that? And also, what is that like for you and your congregation or your worshiping community?
Well, it was interesting when, especially during the height of the pandemic, I had a conversation with one of my members of my church. We had been worshiping offline, but I gave them a list of all the churches that were meeting online, and because we didn't have technology, I was sending a worship, like a devotional thing home with everybody. I would go to their houses, I would drop them off, and then I would, do everything socially distanced, and then we would have worship at the same time together, even though we were all separate. But I sent them a list of all the congregations that I knew in the area that were worshiping online at that time. And Mark, you recruited several members of my congregation. They were watching you online on Sundays through the height of the pandemic, and they would watch you. They would watch Catholic Mass. They would watch an Episcopalian service all the way through the week. And so this woman, she told me she had a worship service every week that she could go to, and every day of the week, and be able to watch a worship service and participate with the congregation. And for her, it was pretty enlightening to see how similar and dissimilar to all of these worship services were, because everything became extremely accessible. So I like that. It presented me with as a pastor, with the challenge of trying to make the case for Methodist worship, of course. But like how do you do that when we're saying the same thing as the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians and the Lutherans, and they're like looking at it going, what is the distinction? And a lot of that, because I'm the executive director at the Broome County Council of Churches, I can kind of say these things and people expect me to say them, but we are dealing with almost a flat world right now. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that everything is so distinct. The distinctions are starting to go away, and people are realizing that the heart of the faith is there regardless of what tradition you come from. So I thought that was kind of an interesting conversation to be in the middle of. Anyway,
the more liturgical churches, the Episcopalians, the Roman Catholics, the Lutherans, and so on, the Presbyterians have become more liturgical through the years, in the past 30, 40 years perhaps. And so when I grew up, there was no lectionary. We didn't know what a lectionary was. And then when I was in Richmond, the churches, the church page in the newspaper, back when we had a newspaper, you'd see the church ads, and the minister's sermons, you could tell who was a lectionary preacher because you saw the titles of their sermons in the ads for their churches, and they were all very, very similar. We went to church in France once. It was in French. I don't know French, but I knew the shape of the service because it was the same as, it was a Catholic French service, but the shape was the same. I knew there was a confession. I knew that there was a proclamation of the word. I knew there was a benediction, the passing of the peace. We have that in common. That's the ecumenical foundation of our worship. But because of our different traditions, we still have some distinctions. Now, even within our traditions, we're having distinctions because, the term worship wars came around maybe 20 years ago because of contemporary Christian music. Others wanted the traditional organ music. Others wanted guitars and praise bands. So,
Jeff, you got to go back 40 years for that.
Really? Yeah.
And worship wars have been going on for a long. The contemporary tradition, the traditional contemporary worship war, is very, very old.
Yeah, and I almost feel like we all learn in different ways. Some of us are visual learners. Some of us are better at auditory, and I think worship is the same thing. Some of us are worshiping, especially during COVID. People wanted to get back and get pictures of the sanctuary at least because it was that place, that sacred place that they remembered and that contributed to their experience of God. Because that's what worship is all about. It's about God. It's not about us. It's not about the music. It's not about the preacher. Once our worship begins to be centered on something other than the holy or the spiritual, then we're really off base.
Yeah.
Joe, I really appreciated what you were saying. one of the things that's changed, I think, during the pandemic is people coming to me leading with these words to a sentence: "Pastor, I recently heard," or "Pastor, I recently read." And what they mean by that is during the pandemic, I think sometimes we have this idea that people just sat home doing nothing, eating bonbons, and that's all they did. That's not at all. They were engaged. They went to places on the internet and listened to different people, different theologies, different understandings. And what I'm seeing, that you were talking about change, Rachel, what I was seeing was this was coming back to the church. You know, that why are we worshiping the way we're worshiping? What are these elements, and can we question them now? Which has been a really interesting dynamic.
So friends, this has been an interesting conversation. And as you know, worship has so many elements to it. We've touched on the sacraments. We've touched on changes in worship, being grounded in worship. We've touched on how is it centered on God, even if we disagree about how we're worshiping God, and what does that mean for the theology that we've grown to know or love, or how that's evolving. But all of these things, if I can leave with you, is that however you're worshiping, wherever you are worshiping, see how God is working in and through it, how you are part of a community of faith, and to reach out to a pastor, whether that's physically, if you can make it, or if you have difficulties and you can just reach out to that community of faith. I know that a pastor or someone from that community of faith would be more than willing to be in touch with you. So thank you again to my colleagues for their hosts today, and thank you for WBNG and from the Boone County Council of Churches for helping us have these conversations to share with you. God's blessings be to you all.
And to you as well.